Donald Trump attempted to project an image of a conqueror, but in just a few statements, the entire performance began to unravel. First came the triumph, as he suggested that Iran had been beaten, decimated, and finished. Then came the ask. Countries that rely on the Strait of Hormuz, he stated, should take care of the passage with the United States, providing significant help. That is not the language of total control. It's the language of a power center, realizing in real time that chest thumping is not the same as having a coherent strategy. The Strait of Hormuz is not merely an abstract strip of water on a map. It is a vital artery in the global economy. Oil, shipping, insurance, inflation, supply chains, airline costs, your gas bill, your grocery bill. If that artery tightens, the pressure is felt everywhere. So when the White House message shifts from "we have already won" to "everyone please help," that is not just a messaging problem, it is a credibility problem. Credibility, after all, is the hidden currency of global power. Then the second layer emerged. Claims that partners were joining the effort to push back suggested that some of those partners were not nearly as eager as Trump implied. At the same time, there was an escalating war against media coverage that refused to align with the official narrative. This situation is now bigger than Trump, bigger than Iran, and bigger than one shipping lane. It raises questions about whether the architecture surrounding American power is being reinforced or quietly bypassed. In the next few minutes, I will show you exactly what just happened, why Trump never saw it coming, and why the world you inhabit today already looks different from the one you woke up in just days ago. If you had a business partner who insulted your customers, threatened your suppliers, picked a fight in a loading dock, and then called you asking for emergency backup, how long would it take before you stopped taking that call seriously? Hold that thought, because that is precisely the question U.S. allies and regional partners are now asking. Drop your answer in the comments. If a leader keeps treating allies like disposable tools, at what point do those allies start building around him instead of with him? Let's rewind the clock. This did not start with the Strait of Hormuz. It began with a pattern, months and months of attacking allies, imposing tariffs on partners, treating NATO like a protection racket, publicly belittling countries whose cooperation Washington still depends on, and acting as though loyalty can be extracted on demand after trust has already been shattered. Trump kept assuming the old system would continue functioning simply because America is large enough to force it to work. That was the miscalculation. While Trump was performing outrage, other capitals were assessing their exposure. While he treated diplomacy like a television segment, other governments were thinking in terms of redundancy, legal protections, defensive postures, insurance, energy security, and contingency plans. Europe has been learning to hedge. Gulf states have been learning to hedge. Even media ecosystems have been learning to hedge. When a superpower behaves like a volatile contractor instead of a stable anchor, everyone downstream begins sketching alternative blueprints. So when the Strait of Hormuz suddenly moved to the center of the story, Trump seemed to expect the old reflex. America calls, and others line up. But power is not just about who has the biggest navy. It is also about who still has the deepest reservoir of trust. On that front, Trump has been draining the tank himself. Now, let me walk you through 3 pieces of evidence because this is where the structure of the story becomes impossible to ignore. The first piece of evidence is Trump's own message whiplash. Earlier, Trump suggested that many countries, especially those affected by any attempted closure of the strait, would be sending warships alongside the United States to keep it open and safe. Later, his tone shifted. Countries that receive oil through the strait, he claimed, should take care of the passage, and the United States would help a lot. Reading those 2 ideas together reveals a glaring contradiction. The official framing sounds like coalition language, burden sharing, and global cooperation. Fine. But the plain English version is much harsher. He bragged first and outsourced second. He projected total dominance, then revealed dependence. He wanted the headline of victory without the burden of owning the aftermath. This matters because in geopolitics, sequencing is everything. If you truly have the situation under control, you do not need to pivot from "we have already destroyed their capability" to "everyone else now needs to step up." That is not a smooth handoff. It is a public slip. It signals to adversaries that there may be more fragility in the system than the rhetoric admits. It tells allies that the planning may have been thinner than advertised. And it communicates to markets that risk is rising faster than the slogans can contain. Trump's defenders may argue that he was simply calling for fair burden sharing. However, burden sharing works when the burden is discussed before a crisis, not when the crisis is already live and your partners have spent months being insulted by the same person now asking for help. He declared victory before securing the exit, and the silence from the supposed coalition was deafening. The second piece of evidence is the response from allies and regional players. One of the most revealing moments came when claims circulated that foreign partners, including France, would join a more assertive naval effort around the strait. A French rapid response account pushed back, stating there was no such shift and that the carrier group posture remained defensive in the Eastern Mediterranean. In plain English, that was a definitive no. Not our mission, not on your terms, not after your improvisation. Look at how unusual that is. Allies do not normally rush to publicly cool expectations unless they want to distance themselves on the record. Official language about posture, stability, and defense may sound technical, but what it really signals is caution. It indicates reluctance to be pulled into a mission whose objectives, legal basis, and end state are all unclear. This connects to a broader pattern. Trump has repeatedly treated Allied support as something he can insult one day and requisition the next. The same instinct showed up when he brushed aside the idea of late joining support from close partners, as though alliance management were a personal loyalty test rather than a long-term strategic asset. But countries remember, governments remember, militaries remember. They remember the tariffs, they remember the threats, they remember the swagger. So when the call comes in during a live crisis, they respond with hedging, not enthusiasm. And the Gulf is watching too. Regional states may still work with Washington. They may still rely on Washington in major ways. But dependence is not the same thing as trust, and trust is not the same thing as obedience. If you are in Doha, Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, or Kuwait, you are asking a brutal question right now. Is the United States still the security guarantor, or is it becoming a destabilizing variable you need insurance against? Trump was demanding loyalty from capitals he has already taught not to trust him. The third piece of evidence is the media pressure campaign. As the narrative became messier, Trump turned on the coverage. He attacked major outlets, complained that headlines were misleading, and elevated the idea that the media itself was the problem rather than the contradictions in his own messaging. He also amplified celebratory material portraying legacy media as weakened, reshaped, or brought to heel. Notice what this reveals. This is not confidence. This is a control instinct. Then came the regulatory echo around him. Trump allies, including FCC Chair Brendan Carr, have used rhetoric about broadcasters, public interest obligations, distortions, and license renewals in ways that many critics interpret as an attempt to intimidate coverage. The official language is always dressed up in civics, trust, accuracy, and public interest. But the plain language is harder to ignore. Tell the story our way or understand that power can be brought very close to your door. That is a huge tell, because when an administration is truly secure, it does not need to threaten the media. It does not need to frame independent scrutiny as sabotage. It does not need to celebrate a media ecosystem that has been hollowed out and made more compliant. Here's the part Trump's world keeps missing. Audiences do not disappear when old outlets weaken. They migrate. They look for independent media. They seek out those connecting the dots honestly. That is the blind spot in the whole strongman theory of information. You can pressure institutions. You cannot erase curiosity. When the battlefield narrative slips, the next target becomes the messenger. If this story is connecting dots you haven't seen assembled anywhere else, you are already ahead of most people watching this unfold. Hit subscribe right now. This is moving faster than any single outlet can track, and you need to be here when the next piece drops. At the Midas Touch Network, we will continue covering it honestly. Now, step back and look at the contrast, because this is where the real strategic lesson lies. Most leaders, when attacked or embarrassed, get louder. They perform anger. They tweet harder. They issue bigger threats. The smarter players in this story did something else. They built distance. They used institutions. They employed ambiguity. They utilized defensive postures, legal language, and quiet hedging. They did not rush into Trump's improvisation. They reduced their exposure to it. That is the strategist's move. And in this case, the strategist is not one sainted leader. It is a whole category of actors learning the same lesson simultaneously. European governments are keeping military moves limited. Gulf states are exploring de-escalation and self-protection. Companies are studying shipping risk. Insurers are recalculating exposure. Independent media is building outside the old gatekeepers, not with missiles, not with slogans, but with networks, standards, and redundancy. Trump, by contrast, still approaches power like a blunt object. He thinks force is enough. He thinks volume is enough. He believes if he humiliates enough people publicly, they will still come running when he needs them privately. But the modern world does not work like that. While Trump obsesses over domination, others are building bypasses. They are opening side channels. They are keeping options open. They are treating Washington as one node in a larger system, not the unquestioned center of gravity. This has been the operating system that has defined Trump for years. Overpromise, underprepare, externalize the cost, and demand loyalty after the damage. That may work in a branding exercise, but it does not work in a live geopolitical choke point. You do not beat chaos by joining it. You build a bypass around it. So, what does this mean for you? It means if you live anywhere affected by energy prices, you are part of this story whether you want to be or not. Shipping disruptions raise insurance premiums. Insurance premiums feed into freight costs. Freight costs ripple through retail, manufacturing, agriculture, aviation, and household budgets. If you work in logistics, finance, energy, or trade, the Strait of Hormuz is not just a headline for you. It is a risk variable that can impact payroll, pricing, and planning. It also means that the structure of business decisions may be changing in ways that outlast any single crisis. Once a company reroutes supply, diversifies sourcing, changes insurers, or shifts strategic relationships because a political partner looks unstable, it usually does not snap back just because the news cycle cools. The contracts follow the new routes. The investments follow the new routes. The jobs often follow the new routes too, and they do not automatically return. Now, let me give you 3 scenarios from here. Scenario 1 is a managed reset. Back channels open, a face-saving arrangement emerges, tensions cool just enough for shipping to stabilize, and everyone claims they defended peace. Trump says he forced burden sharing. Allies say they preserved stability. Markets exhale. But even in this best case, the structural changes remain. Partners have now seen the fragility. They do not forget. Scenario 2 is the domino realignment. This is where middle powers keep learning from each other, hedge more, diversify more, build regional security arrangements, and strengthen alternative networks in energy, finance, diplomacy, and media. The United States remains enormous, still central, still militarily unmatched in many respects. But it is no longer the unquestioned axis around which every other player automatically turns. The old center stays big. It just stops being absolute. Scenario 3 is the spiral. This is the scenario nobody wants to name out loud. Trump hits back harder. More threats, more pressure on allies, more pressure on media, more improvisation around security, more market fear, and more forced choices for governments that do not want to choose. This is how fragmentation deepens. Not all at once, but through a series of shocks that teach every actor in the system to trust the old architecture a little less each time. And that is the final frame here. Whatever happens next, the relationship between Trump's version of American power and the rest of the network will never be exactly the same again. Even if this specific crisis cools tomorrow, the lesson has already been learned. You never put all your strategic eggs in one basket. Once alternatives are built, they do not vanish. They become the new normal. Trump did not invent every pressure point in the Middle East, but he is very good at taking unstable systems and making them more volatile. The countries now hedging against Washington did not start this entire story, but they are getting very good at surviving it. So here are the big questions. Did Trump expose weaknesses in America's partners, or did he expose the limits of his own method? Is this smart self-protection by allies and regional players, or the early stage of a much more dangerous fracture? And if the world is already building around Trump's unpredictability, what exactly is left of the old claim that only he projects strength? Drop your answers in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe, because the next chapter, whether it involves naval posture, Gulf realignment, media intimidation, or the price shock that hits consumers next, is coming fast. This story is not slowing down, so do not look away. This content is commentary and analysis for informational purposes only. It does not constitute financial, legal, or geopolitical advice. Consult qualified experts before making decisions.